I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement and then we will dive in. So Artcite is located on the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We wish to express our gratitude and acknowledge that our work today, I'll start over. And the Potawatomi. Through these online platforms, we are able to host conversations with guests across Wawayatanong and Turtle Island. We would like to recognize that an acknowledgement is just an acknowledgement and is not an act of reconciliation or decolonization in and of itself. This should prompt us as settlers to think about our relationships to this land, as well as our relationships to Indigenous groups who continue to face violence, erasure, and displacement by the legacy of colonialism, which we as settlers benefit from. This includes us at Artcite as we try to make long-term changes towards more equitable programming, which includes making space for more Indigenous, Black, and intersectional perspectives. So thank you all for coming today. I wanted to pass the mic over to Jennifer Willett, who represents Incubator Arts Lab, to speak about the work they are doing and their role as co-presenter of this event.
Hi, Imogen. Thank you so much. So I'm Dr. Jennifer Willett. I'm an associate professor in the School of Creative Arts at the University of Windsor and the Canada Research Chair in Art, Science, and Ecology. I'm here as the director of Incubator Art Lab. We are new neighbors with Artcite. We've just moved into a new studio space across the street on University Avenue. And I'm just really pleased that Imogen reached out to ask us if we would like to partner with Artcite on this event. This programming that lies at the intersection of art and science and ecology and technology, it directly aligns with the research goals of our group. I'd like to welcome Colton Hash. I'm really excited to hear you talk today. I've known your work for quite some time. And I'd also like to say hi again to Michael Lucenkiw, who's alumni from the lab. It's really great to hear from you again and see what you've been up to since graduation. So I just wanted to say thank you very much, Imogen, for organizing this. We're really happy to partner with you on it, and I look forward to doing more again in the future. Thanks.
Hey. Oh my gosh, thank you, Jennifer. It's so good to have you here. I wanted to quickly introduce our audience to Colton Hash and Michael Lucenkiw. Colton Hash is an emerging artist who currently resides as an uninvited guest on Lekwungen territories of Vancouver Island. Hash's multimedia practice is inspired by the wild and anthropomorphic landscapes that surround him. Exploring environmental data as media, Hash strives to create accessible works for viewers to consider their cultural relationships with nature. Hash has received the Witness Legacy Award for Social Purpose and Responsibility through art. He also received his Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, Visual Arts, and Environmental Sciences, and is currently an MFA candidate at the University of Victoria. Michael Lucenkiw is an interdisciplinary artist researcher, primarily investigating ways in which DIY technology can be used to create stronger relationships with our environment. He works with a variety of mediums, including software coding, hardware design, lighting design, experimental sound, performance, interactive installations, data connection, experimental geography, sculpture, and drawing. Okay, so we're going to begin with a presentation by Colton Hash, where we can all learn more about his practice.
Okay. Let me know for some reason if my video or audio isn't working correctly, or if the audio or the video feed is kind of laggy or something. Okay, so yeah, my name is Colton Hash. I identify as a settler of mixed European descent. I'm living on Lekwungen territory on Vancouver Island. And as Imogen mentioned, I have a multidisciplinary background through my undergrad doing a combined program with computer science and visual arts and as well as doing an environmental studies minor. And kind of throughout my time as an undergrad, worked on a lot of different projects trying to connect these various disciplines. And my current work is also directly connecting these disciplines. And I am currently a first year MFA student at UVic. So my practice is multimedia practice. But my recent focus has been primarily in creating interactive data artworks. These are works that try to engage with the complexity of the world around us, usually issue-based, but cumulatively trying to build just more of a sense of understanding of like our complex interactions with landscapes as climate's changing, as technology and infrastructure is growing like ever increasingly fast. Yeah, I just feel like, especially now with COVID and everything, we really start to see how overlapping systems breaking down influence each other, how like, you know, the epidemic is influenced by political instability as well as climate change. And all of these like massive, complicated or wicked problems, we need a lot of creative solutions to like even conceptualize these, let alone approach these. And I feel like art, and particularly this intersection between art and science, has a lot of potential to engage. And in my practice, I'm like always trying to create meditative spaces for people to just be present with these various issues, and just be able to engage with their emotions and intuition, as well as logic and science. I wanted to share a little bit about my background of where I grew up in the Rocky Mountains in Montana. I was heavily influenced by nature and my surroundings. I was really fortunate to grow up in a house where we were completely surrounded by forests, but also every summer the skies would turn orange in July and August. And there was many times in my life where I remember with my parents and family going up to the top of a ridge and seeing a wildfire kind of approaching from a few mountaintops away, and just like wondering if it was going to come for our house, if we were going to have to evacuate, like a few times packing everything up and, you know, putting in a storage locker. So like the presence of wildfire in the landscape around me has always had a really strong emotional impact, but has always been really invigorating intellectually. Like I'm still so fascinated in fire as a process of ecological change. And I'm really fascinated in our relationships with fire as a society, as well as how other cultures around the world, indigenous nations, have a much more balanced relationship with fire and use fire as a tool for land management, where settler society primarily treats fire as like an enemy to be defeated with warlike tactics. It's pretty stark. But I feel like there's a lot of potential to heal our relationships with fire and just learn more about how to embrace uncertainty with nature through fire. Similarly, the environment I grew up around when I was in like high school, about 17, the pine beetle epidemic swept through the Rocky Mountains. It's kind of started in the epicenter of central British Columbia and swept through the Rocky Mountains at a very, very fast rate. And that same pine beetle epidemic is now continuing through Alberta and Saskatchewan east across the boreal forest. But basically within a year's experience, entire mountainsides turning red. And in the decades like following this, I've continuing to experience how the forest is changing as the trees are dying and falling and crisscrossing in these large snags, and just continuing to shape how the forest functions. But also within this is this incredible regrowth that's happening within the landscape. But now I recognize this as a front line of climate change and kind of identify as a climate youth, where like concerns from climate change, how that was impacting the world around me, have been my primary focus basically since I've started thinking more consciously, and definitely led me towards learning more about climate change, and thus like learning about climate systems and working with climate model data. Another huge influence to my work and just my life has been tree planting in northern British Columbia. I've worked about 7 different seasons as a tree planter, where I've seen like tons of roads, cut blocks, and just like weird landscape interactions where basically on the scale of the entire province of British Columbia, we're like developing logging roads and cut blocks. And I'm really interested in like how this kind of operates, as how our culture is interacting with the landscape. And that has led me to look at geographic information systems data that encapsulates some of this information to like better understand this relationship that we're having as a societal level with like entire, you know, like with the landscapes of on a continental scale. I wanted to show a preview of a work that I recently did that's kind of combining some of these different interests through data visualization. This is a project titled Carbon Forest, which is a depiction of landscape data as well as wildfire data recorded from NASA satellites. This installation uses a motion sensor to track viewers as they engage with the work, creating this effect of a digital shadow where the viewer uncovers the underlying data of the resource extraction systems that define these landscapes. So with this project, I've integrating many sources of GIS data to show the current vegetation that exists when these fires were happening. And then I use satellite data recorded from NASA to create an animated time lapse of the spread of these fires. And these fires, like this landscape is actually where I planted my first trees and where I've spent a lot of time. And the first trees I ever planted were replanting a block that had completely burned from a previous fire. And 10 years later, I feel like this fire then burned those trees that I planted. So this is a big question I've always had, is just like, what is the relationship of how we're interacting with landscapes, how that informs fire, and how fire then changes our interactions with the land, as well as how that impacts the climate. So kind of moving on to influences from the ocean. Through the last 5 years, I was really fortunate to have lived in a place where this was like my backyard view, and getting to experience the like weather patterns, the constant changing visuals, and seeing the biological cycles of the ocean was a really like amazing and transformative thing in my life, especially from coming from living in the mountains. But here I've also like pretty much right away noticed the ships parked in the Esquimalt Harbor, as well as the ships passing through the Strait of Georgia going from Vancouver and Seattle. And like immediately I just had like this razor sharp focus on these massive behemoth objects floating in the ocean and recognizing them as these symbols of power, of globalization and capitalism, and also symbols of resource extraction coming from this region. I developed many artworks that directly integrated concerns from this landscape, learning from scientists, learning concerns from community members, like through activist conversations, things like this. I've, over the last 4 years, have developed a number of artworks that integrate ocean data and issues that are happening locally. And as when the opportunities have presented themselves too, I've like trying to integrate the ocean itself into the artworks that I'm making. Through this time, I was fortunate enough to be selected for an art residency with Ocean Networks Canada. This is an organization which operates this large network of instruments under through the Salish Sea and out into the West Coast. They have like all these computers underwater connected to hundreds of different instruments, feeding data into servers that are publicly accessible. And so they were just like interested in artists to be able to work with this data, help like publicize the data some, but also just to like curious to see what people in different disciplines would do with it. So during this residency, I created a number of interactive data artworks that can exist online as exploratory tools, but also can exist in gallery spaces. And yeah, this has like kind of exposed me to this world of interconnections between science and art, where artists being able to work with scientists can have a lot more of a creative, free-form approach to working with data, and can take concerns of people working within these fields and present them in a more intuitively and emotionally driven way than scientists can in how they have to operate in their field. And this also opened up this like realm of art being able to be an education tool, being able to exist in a visual art context, and then also being able to exist in like more of a rigorous science communication context as well. That really excites me. It's just like one project can simultaneously be an art gallery, can be in like a publicly accessible science museum, and can also be like a part of a news article talking about local issues. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about my current work that I'm working on for Artcite Inc. I have been working on creating a interactive gallery space, which is a virtual, which is a representation of the Artcite gallery. And in this virtual space, I've been able to directly integrate interactive data artworks that you can use on your computer, basically. Sorry, Imogen, do you have your hand up?
No, I was just clapping. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Cool. Okay, so yeah, I don't really have time to like fully elaborate and fully explain all these projects, but I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of this. Yeah, and this exhibition will be launching towards the end of March, so you can check that out and interact with it when it's fully ready and online. But this exhibition is developed somewhat as like a replacement for being able to actually physically travel and visit Windsor, experience the landscape, talk to people there, and explore and just be present with like the natural landscape myself. So not being able to travel right now and having exhibitions delayed because of COVID, we decided to do a virtual exhibition. And I'm really interested in like virtual exhibitions still connecting to specific places through referencing the architecture of a specific gallery, but then also having works that are based on specific geographical regions and connecting issues between the Salish Sea and the Great Lakes area around Windsor. So with this exhibition, as you approach an individual artwork, it moves you from the virtual gallery space to the interactive space of each particular work. And then you experience these these data visualizations, which are used to create gestural renderings of various sources of pollution. And as you move through these spaces, you see different kind of layers expressing different issues such as noise pollution coming from ships, to carbon emissions emitted from large freighters and point sources of pollution, all combined together with climate data, which describes like regional weather patterns. And yeah, being able to, the core of this program is paired visualizations, which directly compares like both all of these issues from the Salish Sea to the Great Lakes. And I really was thinking about the movements of ships through these bodies of water as the central point of connection. That both the Great Lakes and the Detroit River are heavily used for as like trade corridors for ships, but are also fragmented and split by the US-Canada border. And this exhibition also includes data visualization works, which are more locally focused. One, this shows various sources of pollution in the Detroit River, and the final work shows a rendering of noise pollution created from specific ships passing through the Salish Sea. And this work gives you kind of allows you to traverse the perception of acoustically oriented animals and yeah, what we see above water. So again, this is like all these works are fairly complicated and have a lot to explore, and I hope you're able to check this out once the exhibition launches in March. But yeah, that's basically the foundation for my practice. I definitely have a number of considerations to share just about this general idea between art and science I just briefly want to mention. I think in terms of engaging with like the complexities that we face in the world, I recognize similarities and potential with art and science that both foster like ongoing dialogues about complex problems, that both artists and scientists are kind of hesitant to give like specific answers about these because these are kind of like unknowable problems and they require constant engagement. And both artists and scientists are able to embrace uncertainty. And these kind of tenets are things that, you know, I think the world and our society needs a lot more right now. But yeah, I'll leave it at that and looking forward to having more discussion with Michael and the audience. Thank you.
Colton, thank you so much for that introduction to your work. And I think that has opened up a lot of very interesting dialogues, potentials, and questions. So thank you so much, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the discussion and the Q&A. I wanted to pass things off now to Michael to sort of familiarize us with his practice and what he's been working on.
Great, thanks, Imogen. Good afternoon, everyone. I really want to thank Artcite and the Incubator Lab for hosting this event and me today. And without further ado, great. As mentioned before, my name is Michael, and I'm an interdisciplinary artist, designer, and researcher. My practice is heavily focused around using DIY tech to foster opportunities for environmental awareness. My research outputs move fluidly between expressions of art, expressions of science, and something in the middle. And so my goal isn't always necessarily to make an artwork or to make scientific data, although those can be the outcome of the work. My goal is more focused on creating connections, and I try to create connections between people and data, environmental issues, and places. I think where I first started to put all the science and art together was when I was studying landscape architecture. In fact, the very definition of that discipline is the combination of art and science to design attractive, functional, and sustainable outdoor spaces. And so this being my first formal exposure to art and design had a huge impact on the way I problem solve. It's because art and science interacting is just baked right into how that discipline operates. So for me, it's always been somewhat natural to move between art and science and let them inform each other in my own process. My thesis project while studying landscape architecture was this cyborg plant, I called it, and it's a plant habitat that has space for plant growing material as well as electronics. And I was recording data on the plant's immediate environment and the actual biological electrical signals that are running through the plant. And from this project, I think two main themes really emerged for me that sort of guided my research since then. The first was that I could really use sensors and open source tech to create interesting responses to environmental data. And second was that I could use this strategy to lend a voice to underrepresented environmental entities. In the case of this project, that was like a plant operating in an urban context. So part of the reason why I work with art and science together, I think, is because climate change is such an overwhelming and complex problem. And I don't know if I can think of a better term than ecological grief to summarize some of those feelings. And I'll just read you a really short excerpt from this paper authored by Ashley Consolo and Neville Ellis, who coined the term ecological grief. And they define it as a natural response to ecological losses, particularly for people who retain close living, working, and cultural relationships with the natural environment. And so science alone is not equipped to address this. And addressing climate change obviously needs more than art, and it needs more than science. And so I would argue that it requires thinking between the disciplines and collaboration within them. When thinking about how to react to climate change, I think often about sustainability. And a classic model to describe sustainability would be this 3 pillars of sustainability. It's a very kind of outdated now and extremely Western oriented model, but for me, it's kind of a reminder of the complexity of climate change. I think when we're addressing climate change, we often want to think about science as our go-to tool to address this, but there's obviously large social and emotional components, and art is far better suited to navigate and respond to these emotional matters. So the work that I do lately really sits on 2 main themes: citizen science and critical making. So citizen science, as its name suggests, is citizens taking part in science. And early on, that looked like citizens volunteering on behalf of a scientist to just collect samples or sort of act as their hand in the field. But lately, this field is rapidly expanding, and now it's incorporates things like environmental education programs and community engagement. There's also a strong component of DIY tech, which is often used to find low-cost alternatives to scientific instruments, allowing a whole new group of people to have access to these tools that maybe didn't have it before from financial barriers rather. And institutions of science have had a long history of being gatekeepers of participating in scientific research. And citizen science really advocates for the inclusion of non-scientist participants, which I think is extremely important. And I also see this as an invitation to let artists into that conversation. Citizen science is also starting to incorporate elements of protest and justice, where these DIY strategies and tools are allowing environmental data to be gathered by communities that have concerns about their immediate environments. When I think about critical making, I think for me, this really encourages me to emphasize thinking about my process as part of the work. And that is a strong element in my own work. I think it also really promotes this idea that there is discovery and knowledge creation through the act of making. And in my practice, I'm often creating devices that include sensors. And so I'm thinking about what I'm trying to sense at the very sort of like finest grain of data collection, the tool being used to collect that information. And also it brings me to the place where I'm collecting, because I'm using those tools in the field to collect information. And this image here is me using an air quality measurement near the Ambassador Bridge, which is a very heavily trafficked crossing. I'm also heavily influenced by the location that I'm in. This is a map of the Detroit River, which is running between Detroit and Windsor, where I recently completed my MFA. For me, the Detroit River was probably the most prominent physical feature, and I was very much drawn to this and inspired by this space. And I was thinking about things like what's beneath the surface, is this water safe, and how can I use technology and sensors to reveal some of the complexity of this ecosystem? Or how could I use narrative and story to invite people to look closer and find a way to make this space and ecosystem more relatable? Seeing sites like this, which is a steel mill that's on the Detroit side of the river, really had me asking questions about how we are treating our local water bodies. And this line of thought became the basis for research in my MFA. My recent work has been very data-driven, and I just want to share 3 projects that interact with data in different ways. And process being very important to me, I'm going to try to keep as much of that visible so that you can see where data comes into play for these projects. So the first project I want to share is called Anthropogeny, and this was a collaboration between Professor Nick Papador, who is an educator and musician, and myself. Nick was approached by the Dean of Science to create a performance based on a data set that was a global average temperature. And so Nick invited me to come on board and help develop this concept. And so this was our starting point, just an actual data set. And you're seeing the year recorded and the global average temperature. And the data set spanned 150 years. And so our challenge was, how can we derive a story from this kind of banal but important data set? Upon analyzing the database a little bit more closely, we started to notice some trends in the data. So I sort of showing here is just like a snap out of my sketchbook, where we noticed like a downward trend, kind of a leveling, and then a sharp upward trend. And looking at this, we decided to break the piece into sort of 3 movements. And so Nick was going to use the data points to determine the notes and intensity of his composition. And my task was to create a visual accompaniment that also responded to the data in an emotional capacity. So fortunately, we had access to an amazing performance space at the University of Windsor. In this room, we had a floor-to-ceiling projector capability, and I definitely took full advantage of that. So what you're seeing here is the points of data plotted and accompanying images from each of the eras that sort of show some of the contributors to global warming in each of those time periods. As well, the screen background red got more intense as that temperature was rising, to really emphasize that sense of warming and make it really personal. This is some of the programming behind that visual. I'm working here in a program called Max MSP, which is a visual coding language. And this might look a little bit like gibberish if you're not used to it, but I just really wanted to emphasize there's a chunk of code in this patch that the database that we were originally handed is literally feeding right into how these works are, or how this work was visually unfolding. So I just want to share with you a quick clip, and this is a screen capture with Nick performing in the background. The audio is coming through okay? So you can see the date at the top. We were kind of using that almost as a metronome to guide the speed of the performance. And I'm modulating the images in response to Nick's playing. So he very much had a kind of a call and response relationship during that performance. And this is the final scene. So you can just see how much more intense that red got by the end. So if you can imagine yourself in that room, it was just glowing red. The next project I want to share with you is called the Environment Machine Shop. Over the summer, I was lucky enough to participate in the Epicenter's Startup Accelerator program, which was a program that provided funding and coaching to help participants develop a business plan. And I wanted to share this project because it's not strictly art or science, but it actually used a lot of the same problem-solving tools I've used in my artworks. And I wanted to transfer that knowledge and process into a business context. So I called my company the Environment Machine Shop, and the ideology of this company was highly inspired by my MFA work. My proposal was to create a not-for-profit entity that focused on creating citizen science tools for environmental monitoring. And I really wanted to have an important focus on accessibility to all sorts of groups, and especially artists. Working with this project, I had to navigate the world of business planning, and which is kind of a little unfamiliar for me. And I was using tools like this business planning document, which weren't things I would expect to come across in an art practice. The initial product offering was a field water quality tester. And this tester had to be small, and it had to be easy to use and modify, and also be accessibly priced. And so the project really focused on having this open source product, and I based it on a chip called the ESP32, which is a very well accepted microchip in the development community. So there's lots of support for people to just mess around and modify it to their own needs. So this prototype was able to measure temperature, conductivity of the water, and pH using these little probes that hung from the bottom of the device. And I used these three indicators because they are good indicators of general water body health. And here's a quick snap of some of the code that supports the data collection that the device is actually doing. And I just wanted to show this code because it was based on code that I had used to support a lot of the artworks using sensors as well. So there's this kind of interesting interplay between sort of like intellectual work through the arts work and transferring that into this like product development environment. And this is basically the 3D rendering of the device. To make it small, I had to do a lot of space programming inside the device. And so that required modeling. And so you're seeing here some of the 3D models used during the product development phase. And here was the actual prototype of the device. And so you can see all the wires and bits, which is an aesthetic that I like to play with. I really want all the parts to be very visible. And I think that just is kind of an invitation to tinker with it and to know what's happening. So it's not a magic mystery device. And just a quick kind of zoom in there, just show you that it's generating, or I guess recording live data on the spot of a creek. And this was, here's an image of it being used. This is a creek that fed into the Detroit River, very near Black Oak Park, if any Windsor residents know where that is. And so this is some of the early field tests with that prototype. And the last project I want to share with you is called the Pollution Piano. And the goal of this project was to find ways to make differences in water quality audible. And so instead of looking at a data sheet, you could find this intuitive and interactive way to understand water samples. This is sort of the starting point for a lot of these kinds of projects for me. And this is a really rough, sort of sketchy blueprint of what I wanted to get done. And so it kind of started with this Arduino, which is an open source microcontroller. I'm using that as an interface to collect water sample information and also inputs from the user, so keys in this case. That information is being sent off to another controller, which is a bit more complicated. It's a Raspberry Pi. And on there, I had programmed a software synthesizer. And so that program was able to translate the sensor readings from the water samples into a variety of pitches. And then that information is sent to speakers. So you're getting an audible response to the samples. So this is version 1 of that of the pollution piano, and right in the front you're seeing the key interface. Kind of tucked behind there is the Arduino, and up on top you're seeing water samples. And so it's just piping sample information right into the electronics to let you hear what's going on. And here's a quick sample of that device being played. You can tell I'm not a pianist. Also, one thing to note too is the notes. They're not moving up incrementally as you might expect on a piano, but they're, because each pitch is being determined by a water sample. And so these samples I took kind of in a linear pattern along the edge of the river. And so you can almost imagine this piece as a bit of a map, because you're sort of seeing west to east samples of the river represented in these like little tubes and through sounds. As this project progressed, I introduced a bit more complexity, and you're seeing here sort of version 2 of that project. Version 2, I think, embraced sort of the aesthetics of the synthesizer, but also was highly influenced by Victorian era scientific instruments. And I think that era really called to me because there's a tendency to kind of add these beautiful decorative adornments. And for me, there's this difficult balance because I want this device to produce useful information, but I also want it to be appealing to interact with, and not, so you're not looking at some sort of banal data sheet. You have something that is encouraging you to come and explore these water samples. This is a bit of the code that was running in the background. And again, this chunk here, I just wanted to show that that's the part that's actually measuring the sample and converting it into a tone. So there's a very direct relationship between the data being collected and information generated in this project. Here's a video of that version. I apologize, there's no sound for this one, so I had to kind of slap a sound file on top just to sort of give you a sense of what was happening. And as you're pressing each key, the corresponding sample lights up, so you really have a good sense of which sample you're listening to, or I guess, or analyzing. And so in closing, I guess environmental data obviously is very integral to my work. I think it inspires my work, it activates it, and in some cases, I try to use my work to elevate the data, so working the other way. Navigating this art science space is extremely complicated, but I think it's extremely important to shake up that status quo. And at the end of the day, the goal of all of this is to generate opportunities to create that empathetic relationship with our environment. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that.
Michael, thank you so much. That was incredible. It was fantastic to hear about these projects, about what you've been working on, and as well, you know, your new business venture and sort of your work building equipment to collect samples. I think that's so interesting. At this point, we will open it up to discussion and Q&A. I ask that anyone, if you want to ask a question and you would like me to articulate it on your behalf, I would be happy to just write it into the chat window, and then I will be following that and I can say it for you. Or if you would like to ask the question yourself, if you go into the bottom of the screen and click on the little react icon, there is a raise hand react on there. So you can also do that. And at that point, I will unmute you and you can ask the question directly to either Michael or Colton. But to start us off, I have a couple of questions for the two of you. I'm very interested in your processes, and I think that there's a lot of crossover, but then distinct differences in the way that the two of you utilize data sets in order to create art and visual work and immersive work and work that affects people. I'm interested in, I guess, it can be, I find even for myself, connecting with things like data set can, especially concerning environment, and that has to do with climate change, it can be kind of challenging to find emotional connections to that material, which is obviously really striking and scary too. But I was just wondering if either of you two have stories of like emotional connection or reasons why you started working with environmental data. Yeah, I think it would be great to hear more about that. So.
I can take a stab at that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, like even looking at a data set, it's very abstract, and especially thinking about, I think the biggest number we're handed is that global temperature. Oh no, if we reach 3 degrees, and what does that even mean? And so I think for me, it's important to generate these kinds of works because it makes that more personal. It makes that more relatable in in your locale. And I think these problems are both like extremely local, but also very global. And so I think applying these opportunities to make those connections are just extremely important so that we can just access what is happening and access what this data is trying to tell us.
For sure. I think that's kind of the success too, of the ability to go out and to be able to collect your own data sets, which is why this new project you're working on is so interesting, I think. What about you, Colton? Any?
Yeah, I definitely think like I try to have like an emotional connection when I'm working with like as I'm creating art. I'm trying to like explore things that I'm just like intuitively interested in. And a lot of that is like emotionally based. So kind of even before I look at specific data, I'm like thinking about kind of things in an emotional and intuitive way. And I mean, I think the kinds of things that have been like most stark for me have been looking at data for all the logging roads and all the cut blocks in British Columbia, especially being a tree planter where like during that job, there's like single locations on this map that I can see where I've had like the best days of my life. And then the next day is like the worst day of my life. And all my friends, you know, kind of going through similar things. And just seeing like this massive place where I spent weeks of just like harrowing days in as just one tiny little abstract shape on this massive scale where there's like tens of thousands of these that people have also related to, but are now just all like on a flat map together and kind of meaningless. I'm like really interested in this connection where like data kind of removes the human context from like land-based perspectives and trying to like translate data and trying to like invest more emotion into data. I feel like it's a way to try to like push back against that like dehumanization and that disconnection from the land. But also just like learning these issues. Yeah, it's like really complex and overwhelming to see like what our impact is on the earth. And that also like, I don't know, I think it's important to activate that emotional space through art.
For sure. Do you think that perspective on your use of data is at all connected to where you are and where you grew up? I think the couple of times I was lucky enough to travel over to British Columbia and to be in the mountains, you just feel this sense of like smallness and the sort of the power of that environment to protect itself, especially when you're talking about forest fire and our sort of relationship to it as human beings. But I guess sometimes you're in natural environments where you think like this thing, it's bigger than me, it's going to be here after after civilization you know, like crumbles due to this I mean that's connected to climate grief, ecological grief as well, as Michael was talking about. But yeah.
Yeah, I can think briefly, just follow up on that. Yeah, like I mentioned in my talk, like forest fires have been something that's always really stuck with me as like this force of nature that we just like can't contain. Once fires get to be a certain scale, like the only thing that's going to put them out is a change of weather. And then similarly with climate change too, like once these various feedback systems of climate change are kicking in and like making the problem worse, there's only so much we can do at that point. But I like those kind of things try to make me want to keep in mind the like power of natural systems, and not in this like binary human versus nature thing where like nature is going to overtake us because of the bad we've done, but just that like we're a powerful force enacting on the land, and nature is also a powerful force that has various processes of healing to deal with trauma, but also has various cycles that it's going through to you know, continue driving forward change. And like, yeah, I guess that's the kind of space I'm wanting to engage with in a less didactic way than like everything we're doing is bad, everything nature is doing is good, but just like these are complex systems that are all connected and interrelated.
Right.
Yeah, maybe I'll just touch off on that too. I think what's really inspired my use of data in this and just like using sensors to collect data is like this ability to see beyond our senses, to get an appreciation for the beauty of these natural phenomena. Early on, that project with the plant, we can't detect what's happening inside a plant, but with sensors we can. And so this object that looks still to our eyes, we can actually start to see, no, there's tons of things happening in here. It's reacting to us being there, it's reacting to what's happening around it. And so for me, the data has been a way to get closer and find a way to develop appreciation for these different sort of ecological processes and objects and items.
Thank you. I have a question from in the chat window here related to visual representation and aesthetics. What are your decision-making processes in figuring out how to best show the data you collect? An interesting contrast between both of your practices is how you decide to represent data and how accessible it may be to the people who need to understand, make changes in their daily lives to combat climate change. How do you consider the viewer who may not have an arts background / ability to read images in your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yes.
That's a difficult question. I think that's the struggle, isn't it? Trying to find ways to make these things relatable. I think for me, sound is a way that I can start to do that too. It's not necessarily visual. I think we're often inundated with visual imagery in our lives, and it's like almost like a blur. And sound is a way to just kind of like snap you out of it. And people have a bit of a different relationship with sound. I think it activates the imagination, and so I think for me that's a way to get people thinking about it in a way that they can relate to, because they're sort of bouncing off their own memories and experiences with that data.
I'm kind of becoming, a lot of my work is influenced by some of my like media activist work that I've done, that I've been creating infographics or animations to like clearly convey an environmental message. And then all of those things have like a specific point that I want like the viewer to like agree with. And that kind of work, that kind of like didactic media making is something I'm like stepping back from to allow audiences to conform their own conclusions, and to not be like approaching this as like, you know, changing how people think or changing how they like act in relation to things like climate change. But at the same time, I do want like works to be clear. And I think that's something why I've stuck with like making maps and having features on a map where you can look at and be like, oh, this is Victoria, this is Vancouver, or like this is Detroit, Windsor, and have like recognizable features so that you can place yourself in the landscapes. And so you can like, you know, so that you understand what you're looking at in that context. And all of that's borrowing, you know, visual techniques from like Google Maps to like Google Earth, or just, you know, like we like see these kind of maps on our phones and in our daily lives. So there's like a visual language that I'm drawing on for people to easily connect with it. But then after that, I'm not really super concerned with precisely representing issues or precisely representing data or trying to convince people of a certain point.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. I'm going to give the mic quickly to Dennis, who has his hand raised.
Thank you. I want to thank you both for your talks. I come from the science background, so it's really nice to have your skills to conceptualize this stuff. It's really, it's something I'm horrible at. So I like the fact you guys are doing it. My question specifically is for Colton, because I work on underwater sound. And I know these data files can get huge, and the amount of data, the data you're dealing with is huge. So how do you sort through all that to figure out how best to conceptualize your points and how to sort of work through that massive data to then coalesce it into such a nice visual image?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. Yeah, I imagine you're like, have you been working with acoustic data, like hydrophone data and things like that?
I do fish sound and boat noises.
Yeah, that was a thing when I was working on this project with Ocean Networks Canada, where I was creating the visualizations of the different sounds they made. There's kind of a little like thumbnail graphic that you can see a audio spectrogram of the profiles. So initially I was just kind of like looking at the audio spectrograms and seeing just visually what drew me. Like the shapes that these sound files created were really interesting in themselves. But then after that point, I was using like a vessel tracking software to kind of see where ships were passing at a certain point, and that gave me like specific days for specific ships and specific times to look at. But still, there's like this I was, you know, downloading a lot of data, downloading these massive sound files, and then making it to a program where it can be available online. I'm like writing some of my own code or developing different processes to like compress these massive files into these very small things that run efficiently. And, you know, like this, for detecting like fish noise, you need to preserve all of that data. But for something like engine noise, you know, you can like crunch those files down quite a lot.
Great, thank
But I
you.
imagine it's really difficult to see like the spectrograms. You can't really see like the fish noises as easy as like ships.
Yeah, taken over by the ship. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
I have another question coming in from Marianne. I'm going to ask them to unmute now.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation from both the artists. I guess what I wanted to touch on wasn't so much a question, but just kind of a general like comment or open question, but not so specific about the work. Yeah, I'm kind of right now thinking a little bit about the concepts of environmentalism versus ecology. And I'm kind of wondering about like the not the pertinence, but yeah, a little bit the pertinence of using data sets in order to convey a message in terms of like a critical message on how we're inhabiting the world. I think that, and yeah, so I'm just kind of curious maybe to hear both Michael or Colton on the reason why they're using data, let's say about around data on temperature, and why they're deciding to use that kind of data to convey the messages that they're conveying. Yeah, sorry if it's maybe it's going in different directions. I'm sorry. I can clarify if it's not clear enough. Sorry.
I guess so sometimes it's something we pick and sometimes it's something we don't pick. So for the visual project that I showed, that wasn't really a data set that I got to choose, but it was given to me, and sort of my task is to find a way to make it relatable. I think Colton's work is a bit different than mine, and he's often reaching to data sets, and I think a lot of my data is a bit more ethereal or kind of like in the moment, very instant and fleeting. So yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I often think about bias too in these data sets. There's a ton of bias in how they're measured, and who measured them maybe had a different intention of what we're using them for. So there's like a whole layer of complications even in grabbing these data sets. So, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think it's kind of like intuition. Sometimes I'm in a spot and, you know, something strikes me like, oh, there's a hugely powerful diesel smell here, and trying to figure out like, how can I quantify that in some way? And so maybe I'll hunt for a data set to support that. Or sometimes I'll find a device that can show that. I guess the data set for me acts as like I can translate that into something else. And so it's sort of almost like a driver in the work, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think the thing, like the kind of ideas that bring to mind that question of like, for one, I guess there's this thing of using data sets where I feel like science communication is trying to like convey exactly what the data is in this way that's like not contaminating the data, and is usually like focused on only showing one variable at a time. So that's this kind of thing where I feel like just a straight visualization of scientific data is something that's not that interesting to me, because it's like still only like looking at one variable or one phenomenon. And I am just generally interested in just trying to create works that convey how complex and interconnected different systems are. And so like, yeah, if kind of similar with what Michael said, if there's data sets available that show those complexities, and then I can then like layer on multiple data sets over top and show multiple data sets together, I feel like that's just like, you know, an effective way to show these like interconnected systems. And I think the thing about that I've been thinking about with a lot of these issues is just the massive scale of some of this stuff. Like I've, you know, done some works where I'm like, I could paint, you know, a single like wildfire perimeter on a landscape and convey data in a more gestural, emotional way. But when we're talking about like the wildfires that have happened across the entire west coast of the US or on the entire east coast of Australia, like these landscapes are just so large and these phenomenon are so large that I feel like it requires data visualization to be able to conceptualize like global problems. But there's also a way, you know, you could make like a gestural abstract painting in the same way that communicates the same kind of ideas. But there's, I think, having a clarity and having a focus on the massive scale is something that leads me to like continually to working with data.
Thank you so much. And that was an amazing question. And I think it really, yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much, Marianne, for that question. I was wondering, I mean, I wanted to sort of talk about borders and internet and like the sort of the presence of international borders and how that plays a role in both the work that Colton, you make, and also Michael. So Michael, you were talking about collecting data and before the talk too, we've been talking about the presence of Detroit and the Detroit River and sort of how regionality plays a role in the work that you do and affects the kind of data that you collect. With Colton, you know, you're interested in the Salish Sea and working there, which borders Seattle. So I was just wondering about that presence of the border, how it affects these ecologies and how that influences your artistic production and the work that you make.
I can take a stab at that. Yeah, I mean, very rarely does a political boundary also line up with an ecological boundary, probably almost never. And data collection is an extremely expensive endeavor, and so often those projects end up being conducted by like a federal government of some sort, and so they are more or less confined to their political boundaries. And so being here in Windsor, looking at factories in Detroit, you know, the line doesn't stop in the middle of the river in terms of what impact is going where. And so we were actually kind of discussing this before. Early on in some of my research, I was trying to use some data from the EPA in the United States, but due to the government shutdown, I actually couldn't reach that data. All of that stuff was closed. And so, you know, the political complications make data collection difficult. And I think too, that's a really great spot for citizen science to intervene, because these are initiatives taken on by people on both sides of the border or anywhere to start working. You just need someone who, you know, starts these talks. For me, I guess the border has played a role in that it has occasionally limited my ability to collect data. I can get water samples on this side of the river. It's not so easy for me to jump across, especially now with COVID, it's pretty well impossible. A project that I would like to get going in the future is one where using sort of wireless sensors, being able to have a collaborator on the other side sending me data and sort of vice versa. And so we can actually start to think about measuring on both sides and crossing between those borders, which is probably not a thing that happens a lot right now.
Of course. And Colton, because your work, it sort of deals with maps as well in this interesting way, it's sort of directly connected.
Yeah, a lot of times I don't like include borders at all, you know, kind of just to like in making maps, just to show that like these borders really don't exist, and that these you know, landscapes and like waters of body or bodies of water like the Salish Sea do not have this natural boundary. But it's also interesting to see like especially through the Salish Sea, there's this weird like zigzag thing that happens with the US Canada border. And when you're taking the ferry from Victoria to Vancouver, you like cross that multiple times. And it's just like totally arbitrary and just seems like totally absurd. And as far as like ecological responses to local issues, like Washington, I find is way better than British Columbia is in acknowledging things like the southern resident killer whales, and also acknowledging things like ocean acidification. There's like almost no information from the government about ocean acidification, but it's like that kind of acid, carbonic acid, and warmer water flows across that border. In general, with looking through different data sets, it totally depends on jurisdictions. Like different provinces have different data available, and different countries definitely have different data available. And it's always just like interesting seeing what is available on what websites or what agencies, and especially things like pipelines, and even power lines. Like this kind of data is proprietary, and some municipalities or jurisdictions have this kind of data available, and others, like kind of for the whole, like for the federal government of Canada, like that data is really not accessible, does not exist. And surprisingly, in the US or even Texas, it's like that you can get extremely high resolution data for that. So if you're trying to create a map showing like all the infrastructure across North America to show this like relationships between capitalism and the environment, there's these massive gaps in the data, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's something not there. It just means that there's not data available for the public, which does in itself, like, you know, that there's a lot conceptually going on there too, and that's relaying information as well. But there's this assumption that if like there's data, it's real, and if there's not data, it's not happening there. And a lot of that relates to like, is it available to the public or not, and why if not?
Yeah, I think that I have a lot of ideas based on what the two of you were talking about. So that I think that question opened up a lot, and we can hopefully return there. I have a couple questions here. How precise the scientific data should be to establish an artwork like what you both made? Do you think this data should be original and considerate to its related scientific fields?
I can kind of jump in on that one pretty quickly. All of the works that I make, again, I'm not really concerned about expressing like exact numbers, but it's more of just conveying basic relationships. Like when thinking about climate change, I mean, you know, I like to think about how we are like emitting CO2, various greenhouse gases, and how our cities, our infrastructure is like breathing out these gases, but then at the same time, vegetation and forest is absorbing that, and like the ocean is absorbing and simultaneously emitting greenhouse gases. And so like what I'm more concerned with is not the rates, not the numbers, not how much is being emitted where, but just the fact that there's like this exhale, inhale going on with the climate that we're a part of. And in that, I like absolutely clobber data when I'm working with it. And I always like explicitly say, I'm not a scientist. I'm not creating scientific models. I'm an artist playing with data. And for me, just having a sense of like play is really important. And that allows more space for like emotional engagement as well. So not precise at all is my answer for that. And a lot of the data too, if there's something that doesn't exist, like there's not really models at a small scale showing how carbon is emitted on a local scale. And there's not satellite imagery for that kind of thing either. So like, I'm kind of making some of the stuff up as I go, but I want it to feel authentic, and I want to get feedback from scientists and researchers to make sure things aren't like overly misleading. So there's a bit of push and pull there.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think for me too, that's a good question, especially too, because I'm like building with these sensors, and so considering their accuracy is pretty important. And I guess for me, it's not about necessarily generating science, but generating knowledge, and science and art both contribute to that endeavor. But considering, I guess, the accuracy, there's lots of different kinds of research, and some of them are extremely, I know I can find the specific relationship between A and B in a lab, and that can be important information. And some of it is about field observation, which is collecting, general trends. And so the level of accuracy that I'm working with doesn't, I don't know if I can claim a causality relationship with anything, but I can see general trends. And I think in the context of citizen science, these devices they're about drawing attention to issues more than they're about getting specific numbers and demonstrating those trends. And that's sort of brings maybe a beacon that says we need to look at this area with a higher focus. Actually, too, and thinking about this, and I want to throw this question to Colton. Do you feel kind of like responsible for that sort of like new data that you're sort of sending into the public realm? I know for me, I've played it a little bit safe. A lot of my works are just sort of like showing information that maybe wasn't accessible with our senses, but there could be a lot of finger pointing, and I have to be careful if I'm saying I measure this amount of pH. Was it you? And what that says. And if we're just playing with data too, I guess we have to. How do you feel about being responsible for what you're sending out there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, I think a lot of my art making with data is informed by my previous practices of doing activist media, like I mentioned. And so I am expecting this ultra critical feedback of you're fixing the data, this thing's wildly inaccurate. And I don't want to be misleading people, and I definitely don't want to be this is the biggest issue in the world. This is the most pressing thing that everybody should be focusing on their time on. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not making data sets available. I feel like it would be that kind of thing. I feel like would be a lot different if I was putting up some of my artistic models or putting up my compressed data as formats that other people could use. But yeah, so the data I'm working with and how I'm processing that is only available to me as files, and then that's just presented visually. But there are relationships that can be drawn from that, and the projects I'm showing, the wildfire visualization one with all the cut block data, that's showing this relationship that middle-aged cut blocks don't burn. It's new cut blocks, old cut blocks, and older forests are the ones that burn most severely. But there's middle-aged cut blocks, tree plantations that are the things that are less prone to fire. And that is a very strong conclusion that's offering. And I've not really heard any scientists talking about that. And it's definitely a question I've had, but those projects show this relationship that has implications. And yeah, I guess that's kind of something that I am concerned about, is if it's making a pretty strong statement, especially something that doesn't have a lot of scientific research or basis on it, that I do feel accountable for, if that's potentially misleading, or if that's then justified to continue doing relationships or continue interacting in ways that are damaging.
Marianne, you've had your hand up, so.
Yeah, I'm finding this conversation really interesting. And I like how Michael and Colton, how I feel like you're approaching data differently a little bit. And it's making me I just prompted this thought where, in a way, there's always the object and then the data, the way that you're measuring, and then there's an output, right? It's never the same. The object, there's I see it, I conceptualize it as a 3 steps. There's the thing in itself, the data and the flow, and then what's coming out. And so I feel like there's always an alteration no matter what. And so it's how much value are you putting on that alteration? I find interesting. And then if I'm trying to wrap it up to the initial question of trying to create meaning, create concepts, it's are we here to analyze or living situation through numbers, or what the aim is? And I feel like for me, that's where maybe how you can kind of shape that conversation. It's, are we talking about numbers? Are we talking about temperature, Celsius difference, or like what is the message that's being conveyed? And I find it really interesting how both of you are kind of articulating that in different ways. And I feel like it just, I've been reading, I just started reading Staying with the Trouble from Donna Haraway. And I don't know if you've read it, but it's a really good book. And she says in the book that change on Earth is not the problem, but it's more about rates and distributions. And I find that really interesting too. And I feel like both your work are showing that by creating like interactive work that's trying to have more of a, what's the word, like macro analysis of what's going on, which can be hard when you don't have access to the data that you're using. So yeah, thank you everyone for this conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was working with the plant that I showed you, that's something I really started thinking about. And my education in digital mapping also really had me thinking about bias in data and where that data was collected and why. And at one point, because I was running all the processing off my computer, I actually shifted the sounds that it was making from these like beeps and boops to like R2D2 sounds or whale sounds, and just to show like I could make mumbo jumbo out of this relationship if I wanted to. And it's really up to me to decide like how I'm presenting this in kind of like an honest way. And you can't avoid bias. You're always going to have bias, but if you are aware that you're making bias, you can at least do something to mitigate it or work with it. And I think too, an important part of this like data collection is this kind of like not in my backyard idea. And I think that's a big part of what, I think why some of these like contributions to climate change continue. And I'll give you an example from my hometown in Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg, which is north of the city, is like, it's becoming quite polluted. Like there's these huge algae blooms, and a lot of that impact is coming from Winnipeg, but the lake is like 100 kilometers away. And, I don't really see necessarily the relationship between what I've just poured in the drain and what's happening in that lake over there. It's well out of my backyard. And so I think for me, working with the data in this way, again, it's this like grabbing your senses beyond what we have to make that relationship stronger. And so, if I can bring those effects to you right here, I think it will help make a different relationship between your actions and that space that you're impacting. So I think that to me is like a really strong case for using data with some sort of story narrative.
I have another question coming in from Amanda O'Keefe. What opportunities and challenges do you see in bringing an ambient awareness of data into everyday experiences in our communities? I love that question, by the way.
Yeah, I think that's great. One thing that I think about and just recognize with working with this data is how incredibly like accessible all of these things are. Like all the tools I'm using are free open source like programs to be able to process various data formats, and all of the data I'm using are just like publicly available on a website. And as far as like people's like experiences in communities doing like activist work, whatever, or planning, organizing, there's just so much information that's available. Basically anything that's like available to the government is also available to like everybody at every level, and requires, definitely like technological skills and a bit of experience to like sort through that, or know what things to type into Google, or know what websites to go to. But I feel like in general, building like data literacy and building tools will like ultimately empower people at individual levels and also at community levels. And then like, yeah, what Michael said too, the like power of citizen science and data collection. A lot of times data is not being collected. Well, like the only data that's being collected is the stuff that gets funding, right? And, you know, there's intentional decisions by governments, by industry, not to collect certain types of data sometimes. And so that also being able to collect data on our own and use various tools to process that is like really empowering. But yeah, there's a technological barrier with that too, but hopefully that'll become less and less.
Opportunities. There is a website and group that I have been following for a number of years called Public Lab. And I think one of their early projects was supporting a community. I'm roughly paraphrasing the story, but essentially there was a nuclear power plant and they were using some river water to cool their reactors. And they're required to return the water to a certain temperature before returning it to the river. Otherwise, you're getting these weird impacts. And so the plant is claiming we're doing this, and the residents don't feel like that is the case. Politics, blah blah. The city's not particularly interested in doing anything other than taking the power plant's word. And so Public Lab is able to give these communities a cheap tool that they can go in and start to generate their own data for somewhere like, as Colton's mentioning, may not exist yet. And so to me, that is an incredible opportunity to let people test and explore something that maybe is politically difficult to access. And challenges, something that I've really been finding over the last few years is it really is a skill set to build these things, and you do need some tools. So as much as I try to make these accessible and lower the bar to entry, there still is a bar. And that's something that I've kind of become more and more aware as I start to get a little bit more hands-on in building these things. And I just want to add to when I first read your question, I was thinking about ambient data in the community, and that just made me think about like anything is data once you collect it. It's just interesting. Like just even looking at the river, it's just a river, but it can be data when I apply a tool into it. So like where does the data begin? It's just kind of a question that may have no answer, but something I was thinking about.
Wow, I think that opens up a bunch of possibilities, science-based possibilities and also creative possibilities, and sort of ways of different avenues of connecting us to climate change and to environmental issues. I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately, today. But thank you all so much for coming. And if anybody else has any questions or would like to connect with Michael or Colton further about this really engaging topic, feel free to email me, imogen@artciteinc.ca, and I can connect you with Michael and Colton through email. And I will also probably encourage you to purchase an Artcite Inc. membership, which I'm going to do now as well, and say, if you enjoyed this programming, please sign up for a membership, because we continue to do virtual events such as this one. We do online exhibitions, and hopefully soon we will be returning to physical events, physical exhibitions in the future. I also wanted to briefly just shout out, we have a new call for an artist in residence. We're looking for Black, Indigenous, or POC artists from our region to participate in a 1-month residency in May. And our theme for that is the intersectional issues associated with environmental racism. So if you were interested in this discussion and you live in the region and you're a BIPOC emerging artist, please apply and tell your friends to apply. The deadline for that is March 22nd. And finally, thank you so much to Michael Lucenkiw for joining us today, and for the Incubator Arts Lab as well for co-presenting this project, and Colton Hash for being here. Colton Hash's solo online exhibition, Fractured Waves, will open through Artcite Inc. on March 27th. So be in touch, and if you sign up for a membership, you will get many reminders and information about that exhibition. Okay, I keep thinking of things, but if there were any students in attendance today, Artcite Inc. also offers free memberships for students, which we're really excited about being able to offer that. So again, you have my email, you can email me for more information. And yeah, I just wanted to wish everybody, you know, a really good and happy Saturday and weekends. So be well, everybody. I'm going to close out the talk. Thank you again. Thank you, Incubator. Thank you, Domenica, for helping. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for submitting questions as well. Those questions were amazing, and yeah, the conversation was really, really engaging. So thank you. This will be recorded online, and we'll post it on the Artcite YouTube next week, so you can revisit and you know, look back with feelings of nostalgia on this conversation we all had. Okay, goodbye, everybody.